Hello, I'm Alan Crosby and I'm the editor of the Local Historian. It's a great pleasure to have been asked to talk to the Society today. I'm actually in Norfolk when this is happening, and so therefore I haven't been able to appear in Banbury in person. So I hope that this online presentation will work both in a technical sense and also that it will be of interest to you. I have lived for over 40 years in Lancashire, and much of my work is to do with the local and regional history of northwest England. So I perhaps ought to say something about why I am interested in Banbury and its hinterland in Banburyshire. The reason is that my forebears, the Crosbys, were a Banbury family, that my ancestors lived in Banbury from at least the 1580s onwards, and they continued to be significant in the town until the end of the 19th century. My great-great-grandfather was the mayor of Banbury in 1872, and he served on the corporation and the Board of Health for over 30 years. He was one of the people who was instrumental in bringing Banbury into the modern age in the late Victorian period. So I've always been interested in the town itself and its history and the context in which my ancestors lived. And this is part of that investigation. I want to say at the outset that I'm not the first to be interested in this subject, that crucial work was undertaken by Barry Trinder, whose seminal work, the seminal book, the Victorian Banbury, was published in 1982. In that book, there is a chapter 3, titled as Town and Country, the Local Economy Before the Railways, in which Barry emphasises that Banbury was the centre of a very wide area of a sort of market hinterland, and that its influence spread into adjacent counties, not just Oxfordshire. He notes that the term Banburyshire was already much used in the 1830s, and that it was not just an affectation because, as he says, Banbury's economy was in many respects comparable with that of most county towns. Although a relatively small place, it had this disproportionate influence. And he also notes that the editor of the Banbury Guardian in 1843 was well aware of this fact, this phenomenon. The editor wrote that the town of Banbury was situated at the northern extremity of the county of Oxford, 22 miles from the city of Oxford. It is so near to the county of Northampton that a portion of its outskirts are within the limits of that county, the town of Northampton being 28 miles distant, and continues on the same theme that in Warwickshire there is an area which is the Banbury district, and that areas of Gloucestershire and Worcestershire were likewise part of Banbury's very extensive market area. And he concludes, the editor concludes, that to the 140 places within a circuit of 10 miles, it may be said to be a metropolis. The significance of that in terms of county boundaries is very clear. It is one of the perhaps pieces of evidence which would point to the fact that these boundaries, although administratively absolutely crucial, were not necessarily the defining boundaries of the social and the economic and the cultural life of inhabitants of a place like Banbury. Banbury is not unique in that respect. The historian Alan Everett referred to the Banburys of England, these small towns with a considerable economic significance. And some of the Banburys of England were likewise on county boundaries. So Thetford, for example, had 2 parishes in Norfolk and 1 in Suffolk, or Tewkesbury, which lies at the very tip, at the northern extremity of Gloucestershire, but whose catchment area, whose market area, extended well into Worcestershire. So there were a significant number of towns like Banbury, where the county boundary was to a degree irrelevant to the lives of the inhabitants. In this context, therefore, we can see that North Oxfordshire, with Banbury as its centre, was part of a wider area. And when we're thinking about, for example, a county historical atlas, we need to be aware that the influence of these peripheral towns might well extend into adjacent areas. It means that a county atlas, which is strictly defined by county boundaries, which is to a degree inevitable, does not necessarily give a full picture of how the economy or society of a town worked. So what I want to do for the rest of this talk is to look at a series of historical criteria by which we can look at the extent of Banburyshire, this imagined or imaginary county, and we can begin to sort of reconstruct an idea, at least, of Banbury's sphere of influence. There was no fixed boundary, of course, no defined boundary for Banburyshire. It never had an administrative significance or an administrative identity. But nonetheless, people at the time in the medieval period or the 19th century, indeed even today, would be aware of Banbury as a central place, and we can begin to define that sort of horizon that was so significant in their lives. So let's begin with the next slide. This shows the county boundaries as they were before the legislation of 1844, which began the process of tidying up boundaries by removing and deleting detached portions. As we can see, the county boundaries in North Oxfordshire and adjacent areas were highly complicated. There were detached portions of Buckinghamshire within Oxfordshire and vice versa. But most strikingly, to the west of Banbury, there was the remarkable tangle of detached portions of the three counties, Gloucestershire, Worcestershire and Warwickshire, which were, in part at least, a consequence of the former existence of the county of Winchcombeshire, which emerged at the beginning of the 11th century and probably survived for only about 30 years, but whose influence continued. It was fragmented, broken up between Gloucestershire, Worcestershire and Warwickshire. The complication of that being exacerbated by factors such as ecclesiastical ownership patterns. But right through into the 20th century, the impact of that was felt in the fact that the local government of that part of the Cotswolds was strikingly complicated. What really this map tells us is that Banbury, right on the edge of Oxfordshire and the edge of Northamptonshire, Banbury was not somewhere where the county boundaries mattered as much as we might expect. The town itself emerged in the 12th century. Alexander de Blois, the Bishop of Lincoln, who came into office in 1123, was almost certainly responsible for founding a borough and to formalising the market at Banbury. With ecclesiastical patronage of that sort, it had a head start. It was going to grow, or not inevitably, but certainly was likely to grow. The reason for its foundation is that the bishops of Lincoln held extensive estates in the area, and these estates were indeed inherited from the former bishopric of Dorchester. So it was an accident in the sense that the pattern of land ownership, of ecclesiastical land ownership, determine the location of the new borough, and obviously not logical in the sense of the existing county boundaries. So we have a picture of boundaries being largely irrelevant, and this is where the concept of Banburyshire comes in, something which overrode county boundaries to some extent. One measure of the influence of a town in the medieval period was migration to the town, and one of the sources for that information is the existence of locative surnames, in taxation lists and other urban records. Locative surnames are where a surname is derived from the place from which somebody came. If you lived in Banbury and were from Banbury, and you wouldn't be called of Banbury, you wouldn't be called John of Banbury if you lived in Banbury and came from the town. You'd be called John of Banbury if you moved to Northampton or to Oxford or to Aylesbury or whatever. So in Banbury, we're looking for surnames which were derived from places around the town, locative surnames, place name derived. And so they may be somebody from Colworth, de Colworth, or somebody from Buckingham, de Buckingham. If we look at the 1379 poll tax returns, which are very complete for Banbury, we can find a significant number of locative surnames, and plotting them on the map, as I've done here, emphasises a sort of northeast to southwest oval up into Northamptonshire, down into the North Cotswolds, with some outliers up in Warwickshire and Worcestershire. Notably very few to the south of Banbury, because as a rule of thumb, migration took place from north to south, heading inexorably towards London and the Thames Valley. So relatively few people would have moved north to Banbury, but a lot more people moved from the immediate vicinity. And that's an important point. We can see that the majority of the large majority of these place names, these villages, other communities, were within about 10 miles of Banbury, and that starts to define a hinterland. That shows where in the 14th century Banbury's influence lay. There are other sources which we can add to that list, and which I'm working on at the moment. So, for example, the survey of the Bishop of Lincoln's estates, dating from 1225, excuse me, which lists tenants and again gives their surnames, and a 14th century rental which is in Queen's College, which again emphasises the lists of tenants and the surnames, the locative surnames. So putting all that together, we would be able to make a fairly convincing picture of migration to Banbury in the Middle Ages, in the medieval period, and that would be the first of our sort of building blocks in trying to reconstruct Banburyshire. The other medieval source, which is crucially important, is markets themselves. As a market town, of course, Banbury's influence was heavily determined by the proximity of other market towns, and indeed, as we can see from this map, which plots the markets that existed in 1600 or thereabouts, Banbury was very sort of distant from any other major markets. One of its strengths as a commercial and economic centre was that it reigned supreme in a very large area of the South Midlands. The nearest competition to the south was Oxford, proper competition was Oxford. Northampton, 28 miles away to the northeast. Warwick and Stratford are almost the same distance to the northwest. Smaller markets such as Chipping Norton and Buckingham were within shorter distance of Banbury, but it's pretty apparent that they were, to some extent, even places like Chipping Norton were still were to a degree at least within Banbury's catchment area. The unnamed dots are the small village markets, many of which were by 1600 dwindling away. They were beginning to disappear. The map doesn't show those medieval markets which were stillborn or which were very short-lived. But again, the emphasis here is the fact that in a 20-mile radius or thereabouts, Banbury was the most important market, and thus it drew catchment, it drew commercial sort of influence. Its commercial role was very extensive indeed, far larger than its relatively small population would suggest. So markets and migration, two sort of medieval and early modern criteria, emphasize that point. And we can notionally represent the market area of Banbury by simply drawing a line northwards towards Southam, northwestwards towards Kyneton, southwards beyond Deddington and Adderbury towards Woodstock and Bicester. Banbury's market area was very large indeed. The competition within that was very limited. And certainly places like Brackley, which were market towns, were also within Banbury's sphere of influence. And there's a lot of evidence from even the 19th century to show that people from Brackley were likely to be using services from Banbury. So we've got a market area which, again, reflects that very roughly northeast to southwest expanse of open countryside with small villages and a few very small towns. Places like Kyneton, which had been market towns, were losing status by the 17th century, and they were falling within the orbit of Banbury itself. Fast forwarding to the 19th century, and again reflecting trade patterns, we rarely have much detail about market trading. Where did people come from to trade at the market? But we do have this evidence. My great-grandfather was a solicitor in Banbury, and in the early mid-1870s, for reasons best known to himself, he took over the debt books of a Banbury shoemaker called William Cave. Completely inexplicable, but fortunately his papers, my great-grandfather George Crosby's papers, or some of them, are in the Oxfordshire History Centre, and amongst them is William Cave's trading book, which gives this very important information about where the shoemaker himself had trade. The people in the debt book owed him money for pairs of shoes, and he lists the place of residence of each of them. And that allowed me to reconstruct very plausibly the trading area of a Banbury shoemaker in the mid-1870s. And as we can see, it extends eastwards into Northamptonshire to Marston St Lawrence and places like that, north of Brackley. Very importantly, it extends westwards into the Cotswolds, and areas like the Tysoes, for example, were within his catchment. And northwards along the axis, which is now very loosely the M40, up into Warwickshire, heading towards Gaydon and Wellesbourne and Harbury, where there were other creditors. So what we see here is a trading pattern of an ordinary man, but one which again reflects that wider sphere of influence that Banbury had into Northamptonshire, into Warwickshire, into Gloucestershire and Worcestershire. All of this evidence can be put together to build up an increasingly effective picture of the market area and thus of Banburyshire itself. None of this was reflected in formal administrative arrangements, with the exception of the Banbury Poor Law Union, which was set up under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. The idea behind the Act, aside from all the reforms about the operation of the poor law itself, was to create a rational geography of poor law authorities. Poor law unions were, as the name suggests, amalgamations, unions of multiple parishes, and the decision was taken that these would be focused on a market town. So each union would have a market town roughly at its geographical centre. And very importantly, that these unions would not be completely restricted by existing county boundaries, so that they would be more rational and more logical than the county boundaries themselves. Bringing in the catchments, therefore, of the market towns where they overlapped boundaries. And Banbury is a classic example of that. The Banbury Union, which came into existence in 1835 and was modified in 1836, is shown here by the red line, and we can see very clearly that the decision makers in the mid-1830s recognised that portions of Northamptonshire were within Banbury's market catchment, and likewise portions of southeast Warwickshire were within the catchment of Banbury itself, together with that rather anomalous Shennington, which is the detached portion of Gloucestershire. So what we have from 1836 is the only formal administrative attempt to define Banburyshire, or a bigger unit which represents more clearly Banbury's catchment area. It was a logical process which never produced a logical form of local government. The poor law unions were eventually superseded, and the possibility, at least, of making logical local government structures was abandoned. But the significance of this is that the bureaucratic mind in the 1830s likewise recognised that Banbury's influence extended beyond the Oxfordshire border into Warwickshire, into Northamptonshire. So we can therefore add this to our sort of series of criteria, our series of types of evidence for where the county, where Banburyshire might have lain. Street directories and trade directories give us other information in the 19th century. Russia's directory of Banbury in 1890 lists the postal services which were dependent on the town. Banbury was the central post town for a substantial area. And as we can see here, that same concept, rather like the poor law union, which lapped over into Warwickshire and Northamptonshire. So Banbury, as the sort of centre of a spider's web of postal routes, is shown in this evidence from 1890, with the exception that the railway had come 50 years before, and the result of that is that the postman will get on the train at Banbury and head south to King's Sutton or Ainhoe or to Hayford, and then walk out from the station, extending Banbury's influence to some extent. The railways had that effect, as Barry Trinder noted in 1982, that once the railway network was developing, Banbury became a major railway junction, which augmented its role as a focus for the sub-region. So we've got this picture of Banbury as a post town, the focus of that network, and that's very much replicated or complemented by another contemporary picture, which is the carriers' routes. Barry Trinder has done a lot of work on the carriers' routes, and particularly looking at Banbury as an example of the way that a country town may be the focus of a complex of carriers' routes in the late 19th century. This map is a bit rudimentary, but it shows the routes themselves. It doesn't show how frequent the number of carriers were, but in fact we could add that information to the map, and we would find that within about a 5 to 8 mile radius of the town into the western hills and out into Northamptonshire, there were in some cases 15 or 20 carriers each week running along these routes, while to Coventry and to Oxford and to Burford, it's only 1 or 2 a week. And the picture which we can gain from this is that the town was the focus of a complex and intricate network of village to village, village to town routes for carriers of all sorts, focusing on Banbury and spreading out in this complex network through the lanes and the rural routes into the villages of Northamptonshire and Warwickshire. The importance of this is that this is 1890, by which time the railway network for Banbury was virtually complete. So this complements a railway network which brings longer distance traffic. So this emphasises very strongly the focus that Banbury was for the village communities around. It's very significant that the villages in Northamptonshire, from Daventry towards Banbury, from Towcester towards Banbury, focus on Banbury, that although there are carriers routes from them to Northampton, Banbury is their heartland, as it were. So when we are thinking about Banburyshire, even at the end of the 19th century, looking at a map like this, we can see the influence extending into 4 counties. And we can see the way in which Banbury, still a small town, had this disproportionate influence over a very wide area. So putting all of this together, as I'm in the process of doing, and as Barry Trinder did in 1982, we have a picture of Banburyshire as it was known in the 19th century. Banburyshire extended almost to Daventry, towards Northampton. It extended southwestwards towards Chipping Norton and Morton and Stowe. Southwards it was more attenuated because of the prevailing influence of Oxford. Northwards it extended out to Southam and Burton Dasset and Kyneton. Those were the areas which contemporaries recognised as Banburyshire, even if the name itself was a confection, it was a made-up name. There were other shires in England beneath county level, but they were mostly in the north and the north of England. For example, Norhamshire in Northumberland, or Allertonshire in the North Riding. These were areas which had an administrative significance, certainly in the medieval period. Banburyshire never had that. Banburyshire was always an imaginary county, but we can use this historical evidence to try to reconstruct its extent. And what that tells us, and I come back to the point I made earlier, is that county boundaries themselves, while so much of our evidence as historians is based on county units, county boundaries themselves did not necessarily matter significantly to the people at the time. Banbury's role as a market centre, a social centre, a focus for the economy and society and culture, was its role extended out beyond the county boundary, inevitably, into the North Cotswolds. It was, as the editor of the Banbury Guardian said, it was a metropolis for these areas. So when we're thinking about Oxfordshire, we can look at Banbury and we can see that Oxfordshire was only one measure of the division of the country into administrative units. We could look at other places like Thame or Henley and perhaps find the same sort of pattern. Henley in particular, perhaps, because its influence extended into parts of Berkshire. The result of all this is that Banbury had that higher status. It had a greater influence than its mere population would have justified. In the mid-19th century, its population was only about 4,000 to 5,000, and yet it had a 25-mile hinterland. So Banbury was the metropolis, and my great-great-grandfather was its mayor in 1872. Thank you very much for listening.